1937 to 1939. With the speech at Lucknow, Muhammad Ali Jinnah had begun his ascent towards final power. There was no longer any confusion in his mind as to the aims of Congress or the possible fate of the Muslims in India. He referred to the program of mass contact among the Muslims and the stupendous undertaking it had been to contest the elections in the provinces. Among the people who were numerically in a minority and weak, educationally backward and economically nowhere, he talked of the suffering and sacrifice and the fire of persecution through which deliverance would come, of the nation that would emerge, and of the 80 millions of Muslims who had nothing to fear. Then the characteristic state sentence: think 100 times before you take a decision. But once a decision is taken, stand by it as one man. On 5 November, Jinnah answered Gandhi's letter of protest and anguish over the Lucknow speech. He wrote that he was sorry if Gandhi considered he had made a declaration of war, and pleaded that it was purely in self-defense. He asked, kindly read it again and try to understand it, and added, evidently you have not been following the course of events of the last 12 months. Gandhi waited 3 months before he replied, you seem to deny that your speech was a declaration of war, but your later pronouncements too confirm the first impression. In your speeches, I miss the old nationalist. When in 1915 I returned from the self imposed exile in South Africa, everybody spoke of you as one of the staunchest of nationalists and the hope of both Hindus and Muslims. Are you still the same, Mr. Jinnah? If you say you are, in spite of your speeches, I shall accept your word. Jinnah was more prompt and abrupt with his answer. He wrote, 12 days later, you say that in my speeches you miss the old nationalist. Do you think that you are justified in saying that? I would not like to think what people spoke of you in 1915 and what they speak and think of you today. Nationalism is not the monopoly of any single individual, and in these days it is very difficult to define it. But I do not wish to pursue this line of controversy any further. It has been said that Jinnah was not alone in his study of Burke's speeches, that volumes of them in the libraries were so tattered with use by young political aspirants that new copies had to be sent out to India each year. But the example of Burke's address was perhaps neglected by the leaders of Congress and the League. During the season of arguments in 1937 and 1938, about the time when Jinnah and Gandhi were engaged in their recriminations, Pandit Nehru and Jinnah were exchanging equally acrimonious letters. On 25th February 1938, Nehru wrote to Jinnah, I am afraid I must confess that I do not yet know what the fundamental points of dispute are. It is for this reason that I have been asking you to clarify them. So far, I have not received any help in this direction. 6 days later, Jinnah replied, I am only amazed at your ignorance. This matter has been tackled since 1925 right up to 1935 by the most prominent leaders in the country, and so far no solution has been found. I would beg of you to study it and not take up a self complacent attitude. And if you are in earnest, I don't think you will find much difficulty in realizing what the main points in dispute are, because they have been constantly mentioned both in the press and public platform even very recently. On 6 April, Nehru wrote in the name of Congress, obviously, the Muslim League is an important communal organization, and we deal with it as such. But we have to deal with all organizations and individuals that come within our ken. We do not determine the measure of importance or distinction they possess. Inevitably, the more important the organization, the more the attention paid to it. But this importance does not come from outside recognition, but from inherent strength. And the other organizations, even though they might be younger and smaller, cannot be ignored. 6 days later, Jinnah replied to Nehru, it seems to me that you cannot even accurately understand my letter. Your tone and language again display the same arrogance and militant spirit, as if the Congress is the sovereign power. I may add that, in my opinion, as I have publicly stated so often, that unless the Congress recognizes the Muslim League on a footing of complete equality and is prepared as such to negotiate for a Hindu Muslim settlement, we shall have to wait and depend upon our inherent strength, which will determine the measure of importance or distinction it possesses. Having regard to your mentality, it is really difficult for me to make you understand the position any further. On 30th September, Mr. Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler conferred in Munich, and the Prime Minister returned to Downing Street with a piece of paper which he believed to be a guarantee of peace in our time. The threats of world upheaval drew the attention of the Indian leaders away from their personal conflict, and their game of taunts had to stop. On 8 October, in his speech to the Muslim League conference in Karachi, Jinnah referred to the behavior of the British to the Arabs in Palestine. He claimed that Great Britain had thrown her friends to the wolves and had broken her solemn promises. He then said, only those succeed with the British people who possess force and power, and who are in a position to bully them. He then referred to the Germans in Sudetenland and compared their plight with that of his own people. I would draw their attention and hear also of the Congress High Command and ask them to mark, learn, and inwardly digest the recent upheaval and its consequent developments which threaten world war. It was because the Sudeten Germans were forced under the heels of the majority of Czechoslovakia, who oppressed them, suppressed them, maltreated them, and showed a brutal and callous disregard for their rights and interests for 2 decades. Hence, the inevitable result that the Republic of Czechoslovakia is now broken up, and a new map will have to be drawn. Just as the Sudeten Germans were not defenseless and survived the oppression and persecution for 2 decades, so also the Muslims are not defenseless and cannot give up their national entity and aspirations in this great continent. Jinnah was now the leader of these aspirations. During the 11 months preceding 3rd September 1939, when war was declared, his power over the Muslims was established, with Liaquat Ali Khan as the adept organizer behind him. Iqbal had died on 21st April 1938, having sent a final warning to Jinnah. He had written, I believe that a political organization which gives no promise of improving the lot of the average Muslim cannot attract our masses. At last, Jinnah learned the difference between aloof academic leadership and popularity with a multitude. In the month that Iqbal died, Jinnah was able to say, the League has been growing stronger and stronger every day. Before the Lucknow session, the membership ran into several thousands, but today there are hundreds of thousands of Muslims who are under the banner of the League. The hundreds of thousands who had been attracted to the banner of the League were not all drawn from the adult masses. Jinnah was also becoming a considerable force among Muslims in the universities. This awakening of political interest among the Muslim students and their willingness to follow him came at a time of almost wistful loneliness in Jinnah's private life. He was then 58 years old, and he still lived quietly with his devoted sister. His daughter had made her home with her mother's Parsi relatives in Bombay. She was ultimately to marry a Christian and become estranged from her father for many years. Jinnah had endured all he wished of emotional relationships, and he permitted no one to disturb his disciplined, celibate, recluse habits. But he was slowly learning to unbend with the young in a way that psychiatrists might describe as a manifestation of the frustrated father instinct in a solitary, aging man. One summer, the son of a friend came with a school companion to stay with Jinnah in his house. On the last night of their visit, they went to bed and were almost asleep when the door was opened. The boy who became one of Jinnah's ardent followers in later years, has described what followed. The light was switched on, and we saw Mr. Jinnah in his pajamas and dressing gown. He apologized for disturbing us. Then he said, I could not sleep because you are going away tomorrow. He sat down and talked to us for a long time, not about politics, but about his life in England and of the earlier years when he was a boy in Karachi. When he got up to return to his room, he said he was sorry he had kept us awake. As he turned out the light, he said, I wish that I had a son. One of the first young men to break past Jinnah's defenses was Ibrahim Habibullah, who had just come down from Oxford when he went to hear both Jinnah and Pandit Nehru speak at a meeting. Ibrahim Habibullah walked away from the hall with Jinnah, who said to him, Don't you think that Nehru was talking nonsense? No, answered Ibrahim Habibullah. I agree with all his views. Jinnah then said, referring to some point in Nehru's speech, the laws of the jungle must always prevail. Unless you understand that, you are a madcap. Habibullah replied, We call ourselves human beings because we have emancipated ourselves from the jungle. If you do not appreciate that, then, sir, you are the madcap. Jinnah was delighted with this challenge from someone less than half his age. He said, Oh, I need young men like you. Come and join me. Slowly, Jinnah was gathering his young army about him. Among them, Muhammad Noman, who was ultimately secretary of the All India Muslim Students Federation. He was still a student at Aligarh University. In February 1985, when he went to Delhi to hear Jinnah speak in the assembly and became his devoted and lively follower, at the end of the day, Muhammad Noman was walking with another student when they came to the house where Jinnah was staying. On a board by the gate was the name Mr. M.A. Jinnah. Muhammad Noman wrote two Aligarh students on a card and gave it to the servant. Within a few minutes, they were with Jinnah in his study, and he talked to them and enthralled them for an hour. Muhammad Noman went back to his studies at Aligarh, and almost a year passed before he saw Jinnah again. He has described the meeting. It was at the first session of the All India Students' Conference in Lucknow, inaugurated by Pandit Nehru and presided over by Mr. Jinnah. I think it was the last time they ever appeared on a platform together. Mr. Jinnah spoke splendidly to a big audience of students, but there could not have been more than half a dozen Muslims amongst them. Yet Mr. Jinnah had the courage, before that almost entirely Hindu gathering, to accuse Congress of being a Hindu body. There were some protesting voices, but Mr. Jinnah silenced them. I saw and felt that he was so disgusted by the fact that there were so few Muslims present. I was very young and enthusiastic. I was attending the session as delegate from Aligarh. A few days later, I asked if I might see Mr. Jinnah. I went to him and suggested the formation of a student organization entirely for the Muslims. He agreed and gave me his blessing. Out of that impulse grew the All India Muslim Students Federation with more than 50,000 members all working ceaselessly to attain Pakistan. I became secretary of the federation, and because of this, I saw Mr. Jinnah 2 or 3 times a week during more than 2 years. He was no fanatic. His approach to our problems as students was never sentimental. He liked reality and reason. Muslim student associations were formed in one city after another. You must realize what this means, that the younger generation of educated Muslims became his followers. Mr. Jinnah presided over our first session in 1937 at Calcutta. There were 300 delegates, and he told them that they were a wonderful generation. That was good for them. It increased their self respect. And when they cheered him, he said, Well, many Jinnahs will arise from among you. I have no fear of the future in your hands. In 1938, I wished to go to England to complete my education. I had spent much of my time traveling from one college to another, trying to stimulate the students, but I had much to learn. I told Mr. Jinnah that I had applied to the Hyderabad government for a grant so that I could travel to London. He said no. You must do it out of your own strength. He suggested that I should write the history of the Muslim League, which I did. I remember him saying, "Then you can educate yourself on the royalties from the book." He worked with me. He gave me all the papers that I needed. Hour after hour, he sat with me until the book was finished. His patience with me was incredible. Among Muhammad Noman's talents is mimicry. His imitation of Jinnah was delightful. The raised finger slicing the air with emphasis, the voice, and the solemn look. But the talent which he perfected when still at college once led him into alarming embarrassment. One day Jinnah sent for him and said, "I am told that you mimic me with great skill. Show me how you do it." Muhammad Umad had to stand before him and do his best. At the end of the impersonation, Jinnah took off his Astrakhan hat and monocle and said, "Very good. Take these. They will make it more authentic in future." Another young Muslim League member of the late 1930s, Captain Said Abbas, described Jinnah's power over the students. He wrote, "It was during 1937 to 38 that I first saw Mr. Jinnah when he visited Allahabad. For us Muslim students, he represented the spearhead of the Muslim Renaissance all over India. For the Hindu students, he was an incorruptible fighter for freedom. At that time, they seemed to think that he might still be won over. There was still some uncertainty about his so called communism. He was met with the biggest reception ever given to a political figure, including Gandhi. The Delhi bound Calcutta mail train by which he arrived had to wait 2 hours, while the platform and the tracks were being cleared of the crowds. None of us, the Muslim students, had ever seen Mr. Jinnah. We had all heard stories of his Western clothes, that he was very English. As the train steamed in, we rushed to receive and garland him. We opened the door of a carriage and saw a smartly dressed man in a blue serge suit and stiff white collar. We crowded about him with our garlands. The gentleman protested, "I am not Mr. Jinnah," but I shouted, "You are trying to be modest." Suddenly we heard shouts of Muhammad Ali Jinnah Zindabad. We had chosen the wrong man. We were just about to carry the baffled gentleman on our shoulders. We turned and saw the real Mr. Jinnah. There was no mistake about the thin, elegant, gentle frame after that. It left everlasting imprints on our mind. I remember two parts of the great speech that he made to us at Allahabad University. He said, "Gentlemen, if for bettering the conditions of the teeming millions of this country, if for uplifting the social, economic, and political standards of the Mussulmans of India, I am branded as a communalist, I assure you, gentlemen, that I am proud to be a communalist." There was thunderous applause. Only once was there an interruption when some Hindu students cried out, "Gandhi ji ki jai." Mr. Jinnah paused and there was a pin drop silence. Then he said, in a quiet voice, "Yes, by all means, Gandhi is a great Hindu leader." After that, the students, Muslims and Hindus, listened to him without interruption. During these years of political campaigning, which took him all over the country, Muhammad Ali Jinnah seems to emerge as a happier man. As much as it is possible to judge someone who wrote and said so little, that was left self revealing. For 25 days during 1939, he stayed at Quetta in a house and garden where he could rest. Between the vigorous tours and speeches among the tribesmen of Balochistan, his hostess during this time has said, "I loved and respected Jinnah very much. He was always sympathetic and courteous to me. Only once was he at all angry. It was before a meeting of the tribal chiefs at which he was to preside. There was a strong prejudice against unveiled women in Balochistan. Parda was strictly observed. My husband suggested that because of this, Miss Jinnah should not sit on the platform with her brother. She, of course, did not observe Parda, and neither did I. I protested and said, "Why not? You have to start breaking down their prejudices sometime." Jinnah was quite angry. He said to me, "You are trying to ruin 4 years of work among these people." He meant, of course, 4 years of building up sympathy for the Muslim League among the tribesmen. Next morning, he spoke to me alone. He was most tender and said he was sorry. My little son was then 2 years old. He would run into Jinnah's room in the morning calling, "I want Dada Jinnah." Then he would sit on his knee and they would gossip together. Whenever I tried to take my little boy away, Jinnah would say, "No, leave him." He showered him with presents, a silver mug with a replica of his handwriting on it, an ivory ring with three little silver dogs that rattled. One day he drove into Quetta alone with the chauffeur. We did not know what for. You must realize that he was then a great figure and people gathered wherever he went. We heard the story afterwards. Making his way through a crowd, he walked into a toy shop and said, "I want a rocking horse." You may imagine the surprise of the man in his humble little shop when the celebrated Mr. Jinnah asked for a rocking horse, and my surprise when he walked into the house and gave it to my son. On 3rd September 1939, Mr. Neville Chamberlain declared to the British people over the air, "Consequently, this country is at war with Germany." Almost immediately, Lord Lillian, who had been viceroy in 1936, announced that India also was at war with Germany. When Gandhi saw the viceroy on 5th September, he broke down as he pictured the destruction of the Houses of Parliament and Westminster Abbey. "I am not thinking just now of India's deliverance," wrote the Mahatma. "It will come, but what will it be worth if England and France fall, or if they come out victorious over Germany, ruined and humbled?" On 8th September, Pandit Nehru promised that Congress did not aim to take advantage of British difficulties. He said, "In a conflict between democracy and freedom on the one hand, and fascism and aggression on the other, our sympathies must inevitably lie on the side of democracy. I should like India to play the full part." These sympathetic views did not endure. On 10 October, the All India Congress Committee resolved that India must be declared an independent nation and that present application must be given to this status to the largest possible extent. By 15 November, at the behest of the Congress High Command, the Congress ministries in the seven provinces which they had won in the 1937 elections had resigned. 4 days later, at Allahabad, the Congress leaders reaffirmed their policy of non cooperation and refused to assist in the war effort unless India was declared independent at once. This was Muhammad Ali Jinnah's great chance. The majority of the Muslims were now his supporters and his hand was strong. He called on his followers to observe the coming 22nd December as a day of deliverance and thanksgiving as a mark of relief that the Congress regime has at last ceased to function. To the surprise of Congress, 22 December became not merely a Muslim celebration. Parsis, Christian, Hindus opposed to Congress, and hundreds of thousands of the untouchables joined in the demonstration. This was a day of private retribution for Jinnah. In 1928, when he had spoken before the All Parties Conference in Calcutta, he had been called a spoiled child, with no right to speak on behalf of the Muslim people. The right had now come, adding a new meaning to the phrase, the parting of the ways.